Hello and welcome to this Bob's Guide webinar, 5 strategies to help financial services face the big tech threat. My name is Alex Hamilton, senior reporter at Bob's Guide and today's moderator. I'll be introducing our panel shortly, but first a small introduction to whet your appetites. Google, Amazon, Facebook and Apple. 4 names that have become an ever-growing talking point in the financial services industry. All 4 have made customer interaction, customer satisfaction, and customer usability their watchwords. Whether that has been done successfully or not in recent times is something else entirely. Each have taken their first, sometimes small, sometimes large, steps into the financial services market. Amazon has kicked off a new payment service. Google gazumped a lot of banks with its Google Pay solution a few years back. Facebook has experimented with payments on Messenger, and Apple recently announced its new card offering. Yet it isn't just those 4 disrupting the banking scene. Tencent and Alibaba both have a foot in the door. Considering WeChat has 1 billion daily active users, and Alipay has a not-too-shabby 700 million, maybe that should be a leg in the door rather than a foot. On top of that, a Bain & Company survey from this year found that 54% of people trusted at least one technology company more than they trusted their bank. An Edelman Trust Barometer also put banks' trust at 54%, while the tech firms hung around at 75%. So how can banks bite back? Surely they have much more going for them than just an established brand name and the backing of a sticky user base. To help us explore those strategies today are David Jones, Vice President of Product Evangelism at Nuxio.
Good morning, everyone.
And Scott Abrahams, Senior Vice President of Business Development at MasterCard UK.
Hi, good morning.
That may look different to what's on the slide in front of you, but as we all know, titles in this industry can be a little bit fluid. Both David and Scott will aim to answer my questions as well as yours. In the Q&A box in front of you, please feel free to submit a question to our panel, and we will endeavour to put it towards them near the end of the webinar. We've already had a few submitted before today, so we'll aim to address those too. Before we get stuck into things, though, all the best webinars start off with a poll, so we'll kick things off there. In front of you, you will see a poll. Which big tech firm do you believe will have the greatest disruptive effect on the industry? Google, Amazon, Facebook, Apple, Alibaba or Alipay, and Tencent or WeChat. Please feel free to select which one you think will be the most disruptive and then click the submit button. We'll give you a few seconds to crack on with that. But David, which one do you think might come out on top in this poll here?
You know, it's always an interesting question, and for me, I think it's about familiarity. And for me, the one that will come out on top will be the one that people use most often in their regular consumer life. So personally, I got a feeling that Amazon and Apple will come out somewhere on top. We'll see.
What about you, Scott? Any thoughts?
Yeah, Alex, it doesn't seem to work, actually. I've been trying to press submit. But anyway, I selected Tencent. That's a personal opinion, not a MasterCard opinion, I should be clear to say. And you know, it's because, as I mentioned to you, my wife is Chinese. And I've spent quite a lot of time in China, so I see what they've done there. And when it comes particularly to payments, I think it's a good selection, that one.
Okay, we'll just give everyone the last few seconds. Just make sure you click the submit button that's hanging around at the bottom of the poll there, and then we'll move on. Okay, it's got 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And we're moving on now. Okay, so there we go. We have Amazon ahead at 43.4%, Alibaba 30.4%, Facebook and Google hanging around at about 8%. No votes for Apple, interestingly enough. 8% for Tencent. So, well, you gave your predictions first, David, so you kick things off. What's your reaction to that? Does that line up with what you thought?
Well, I got 50% right, so I said Amazon and Apple. So Amazon, you know, is strong. And again, I think that's due as much as anything to the pervasiveness, the breadth of offerings and the breadth of markets that they're getting into at the moment. Very surprised that no one said Apple. I think as a tech firm, they are making really strong strides into financial services. But perhaps our audience aren't seeing that at the moment. Perhaps we're misreading that. So not surprised about Amazon, very surprised about Apple.
And Scott, we can see there's a fairly strong representation from the Chinese tech firms there.
Yeah, it's interesting for me. I mean, I shared Dave's view around Apple. Certainly, working at Mastercard, that's interesting, given how much work we've done with Apple on Apple Pay, and we're also, they're using our network to launch the Apple Card, the thing that you mentioned at the start as well, Alex, with in partnership with ourselves and Goldman Sachs. So there's been a lot of noise around that within my business, of course. It's interesting that Alipay and Tencent, not that we should put them together, but, they do get quite a significant share. And, and the reason I selected Tencent is just basically because of who I live with and how I see her interacting. And I spent 3 months in China last year, and we didn't use cash once in 3 months. Not once. Which is incredible, when even 2 or 3 years ago when I went to China, nobody would leave home without a few RMB in their pocket, and we just didn't feel we needed to anymore. Every single taxi driver, I bought a kilogram of mandarins from somebody, and I paid using WeChat. It is incredible, and this was in Chinese, right? A small city of only 5 million people, which in Chinese terms is quite small. We never used cash once in months.
Oh, it's quite incredible. I think that sort of ties in quite well to our first question of the bunch. And I'm going to address this to David first of all, and it's a pretty big one to kick things off. So David, what from your perspective has seen the big tech giants become the threat to financial services which people view them as today?
Well, it is a pretty big question. I think I could spend the next 3 hours talking about this because there are so many different reasons. I'm going to focus on 4 key elements, though, and try and describe them fairly succinctly so that we get a chance to move on. Firstly, for me, it's around ease of use and the user engagement that these big tech giants provide. Ease of use is pretty clear to see. It's never been easier to order a laptop or to watch a TV show or to order something as mundane as a toilet roll. But also looking at user engagement. These big tech organizations are what are called platforms. And that does a number of things, but predominantly from a user engagement point of view, it allows users to provide reviews. It allows users to be persuaded by the crowd versus the person actually selling the product almost. But as well, they also allow users to sell on their platforms. And all of these pieces are increasing engagement and increasing trust with the users. And that's something that traditional financial services operators have struggled to compete with. Secondly, it's all about speed of delivery, right? We live in the we want it now generation, almost the instant gratification generation. And I know it's a bit of an unfair comparison sometimes, comparing the instant download of a TV show versus applying for a mortgage. But a lot of the newer fintech organizations are reducing processing times for things like, new loans, account openings, and so on. So they're starting to service this new generation that need that almost instant gratification. That's something that the big tech firms do very well. And again, it's something that traditional FinServ has not done very well. Number 3 on the list, effective use of IT and data. From things as simple as providing you with recommendations for other products when you're purchasing, to creating whole new products from the analysis of customer data. Just think what Netflix do in terms of creating whole new programs and whole new offerings based purely on customer data. Big tech does that very well. And again, FinServ typically doesn't. One example of how you can use data better, or how data isn't being used well at the moment, I won't tell you which organization I bank with in the UK, but they have separate mobile apps for savings accounts versus current accounts versus mortgages. Fantastic mobile apps, but individual mobile apps that if they were a little bit clever about how they use that data, surely they can deliver that in one go. And finally, I'm going to come back to something that we saw in the poll. Actually, for me, one of the key things that these big tech giants have got is brand recognition and brand equity. versus, quite frankly, some fairly negative feelings with regards to existing financial operators. You said in your introduction 54% of people trust a technology firm more than they trust a bank, and that's a a pretty damning indictment, right? Now, being a banker is not very often seen as a positive thing, whereas working for a big tech firm is very trendy, seen very positively. And that feeling rolls over to purchasing from those organizations as well. So purchasing from a big tech firm is seen as something that everybody would want to do. I challenge people to say that that's the same for some of the traditional operators in the space.
Okay, some excellent points there, definitely. And speaking of major brands, Scott, from your perspective at MasterCard, of course, a large global brand, have you seen the balance between big tech and financial services tipping at all?
Yes. I mean, we'd be naive to say that it isn't. I think David made an interesting point. What we see, and I have to be careful, obviously my main focus is payments, which is a large part of the financial services industry, but not the only part of the financial services industry. What we've seen there is, a fight almost to own the customer experience piece, which is I think what David started with, the ease of use, own that user experience. And that's certainly an area where the likes of Apple and Samsung and others have arguably provided a huge amount of value. What's interesting is that is sitting on top of mostly traditional plumbing still, right? We as a payments brand, I would argue our greatest asset is the fact that you can use your MasterCard product in something like 44, 45 million places in the world. Right, that's quite hard to replicate, and so to this day, a lot of the big tech firms at this time are still more interested in disrupting from partnering, if you like, rather than disrupting by disrupting. Now that I think when that changes from disrupting by partnering to just plain disrupting, that's the biggest tipping point, I would say, for us and for payments in general. And I'm not being naive enough to say that day won't come. It could very well come. And, there's margins to be made here for a start. There's data to be gathered here for a start, as David said as well. And in fact, a lot of the discussions around when Apple Pay was first implemented wasn't so much the user experience or the acceptance, but was about the data. And, whether that was banks data, Apple data, etc. I think, but what's interesting to me is that at the moment, I believe that most of the big tech firms are still more focused on disrupting by partnering than anything else. And I mentioned it, but a great example of that is the new digital first Apple card, which is digital only. You if you want the actual physical card, I think you have to pay. So it's a digital card that appears in your Apple Pay wallet, and that's something they partnered with Goldman Sachs and with our good selves on. So I think that's, it's certainly tipping, but my feeling is that tipping point is more when they try and own the whole thing, and I don't know whether that's something that is going to come soon. I mean, I think, Amazon is very interesting there. Obviously, Amazon, I would imagine, I don't know this for certain, but they probably have more payment credentials on file than any other financial services institution, and maybe even schemes in the world. So that's a big threat. What can they do with that? And indeed, the focus on Amazon Pay and where that goes, and we're starting to see that move more into the acceptance brand. That's clearly something that could also be a tipping point.
Okay, it's interesting that you mentioned there, Scott, about the infrastructure play there. Amazon obviously has gargantuan amounts of payments data, and they need the infrastructure to host that data and deal with it. It's perhaps something that banks can struggle with, but is it as easy as simply starting a digital transformation for a bank? I mean, should they really be hopping on the next bandwagon to get the latest technology? Surely there are some major hurdles when it comes to that kind of strategy. Have you got some input on that, David?
Yeah, absolutely. And you say, isn't it as easy as simply starting a digital transformation? Well, starting a digital transformation is very easy. Actually delivering digital transformation is a little bit, if not a lot, harder. And the interesting thing, if you look at the people that are trying to do digital transformations at the moment, it doesn't appear to be working. There was some research that recently highlighted that 88% of digital transformation projects were either late, had to reduce their scope, or failed completely. And that suggests that digital transformation is actually a little bit harder than we think. And if we look at the details and look at why that's actually proving challenging, for me, most people do one of two things. Firstly, they try and digitize an existing process. And let's face it, if you have a bad process, digitizing that doesn't make a good process. It just makes a bad digital process. And for me, digital transformation needs to look at how new technology and new offerings can help redefine the process. Use technology to solve the real problem that the process is trying to solve, not just to reskin the process, to rebuild the process like for like. The second thing is, a lot of people focus purely on that customer experience angle. So they look at developing a new website or a mobile app. And, why are they doing that? They're focusing on customer experience, which is all about the interface. That's what people think, well, that's actually wrong for me. And it comes back to something that we mentioned earlier about the traditional plumbing that many organizations have to deal with. And, for me, projects that focus exclusively on the user interface are going to fail, because in probably 90% of cases, the foundation that they're building on is flawed. That plumbing, most organizations' data and content are spread across multiple systems. And one of the keys for digital transformation, or for delivering successful digital transformation, is getting that infrastructure right. Connecting those systems together to provide a single view of the customer, of the product, of the offering, of the organization, so that the website and the mobile apps can actually use that, and use that cohesively and coherently. If you fail to do that step first, in my eyes, any subsequent steps will fail to deliver.
Okay, so obviously the issue of legacy technology appears a lot in these conversations, but has the problem reared its head for you and any clients you've interacted with, Scott, as MasterCard?
I first of all, I wholeheartedly agree with what David has just said. And, we are, as I say often, MasterCard is a very broad church, right? We have thousands of partners, from very early stage fintechs through to financial institutions that have been established for hundreds of years. So, it's my job to serve all of them in the way that they need to be and expected to be served in the future. Certainly the more traditional players are very much wrestling with, the challenges that David has just laid out. And also, of course, and Alex, you and I have discussed this before, I think to some extent the more newer entrants, particularly more what I would say fintechs rather than the big techs, that they feel to some extent that they've got the regulatory wind at their backs as well, right? Which helps them. And to some extent there is regulatory encouragement for disruption. The larger banks that we work with here in the UK, that will be familiar to everybody on this call today, that they all have those challenges in terms of the traditional plumbing, and that's very expensive to change. And also, and I think most importantly for them, there are risks involved in that. We've seen, haven't we, some financial services institutions try and make some quite significant changes to their infrastructure, and that's not necessarily played out too well from a media perspective. And that's something that, clearly we want to help our partners with as much as we can. But there's a lot of compliance and concern around making those changes due to the fact that, you're ripping out the root and branch, the foundations of your house. And so hence, a lot of the time, I think they end up doing what David just alluded to, which is, looking much more at the face value and the skin of what they're doing rather than the underlying foundations. And although, it's easy, isn't it, to say you need to look at the root and branch, it's much harder and more complicated when you actually come to do it. And it's not just a money issue. It's a reputational issue. It's a compliance issue. And so I have a lot of understanding for those businesses wrangling with that at the moment.
Of course, obviously, it seems that there's a minefield whichever way you want to tread. So, David, I mean, another big question. I'm sorry I keep lumping these with you, but where do you think the solution lies? Is there a happy middle ground between putting this digital makeup on old systems or having to do a destructive rip and replace, as Scott was talking about?
Yeah, I think there is a happy middle ground, and I think if you look at it, go back a couple of years, and that destructive rip and replace that you mentioned was pretty much the only way of delivering a digital transformation. But rip and replace is a very risky, a very expensive, and a very time-consuming strategy. And there's an old joke in the IT industry that any CIOs doing rip and replaces, that CIO didn't stand for Chief Information Officer, but it stood for career is over. Such were the risks associated with doing those rip and replace. I think that there's a new mentality within this space now. There's a new set of tools that allow you really to build and to create an ecosystem of applications and solutions within your business, to extend the life of those existing investments, those existing legacy systems, by connecting into them and creating this ecosystem of connected systems rather than ripping and replacing. And, there's a number of benefits to that type of approach. As I said, it extends the life of those investments. It means that you don't have to go through the pain of doing that rip and replace. But it can also add things like new capabilities to old data. So those legacy systems that you've got with content and data that's been in there for years, there's no chance of you applying AI to those existing content repositories, to being able to integrate them to analytics unless you start connecting those systems together. And if you do that, enriching the data, enriching the metadata that's associated with some of that legacy content is very, very valuable. Think about it from the more, I call it mundane, the more regulatory side of things. So things like records management and retention. Being able to go through and absolutely make sure that the content and data that you're storing needs to be kept, as opposed to the let's just keep everything because we don't have a better solution approach. And then I think also when you do decide that you want to migrate away or sunset those legacy systems, you can do it at your own pace. Not a case of having to do it over a weekend when the systems are down and trying to rush everything through and making sure everything's up and ready for Monday morning. That migration can be done in the background in parallel with your regular working life. And finally, what this ecosystem approach does, and some people love this and some people hate it, but what it does for me is it actually reduces the reliance that you have on any one piece of software or any one vendor. And it moves you to a connected, best-of-breed set of open systems that can be constructed and crafted to deliver exactly the infrastructure and the environment and the foundation that any specific organization wants and needs to be agile, to be flexible, and to deliver that level of customer service, customer engagement, and brand engagement that customers are looking for now.
Okay, I mean, I think that's definitely the case when it comes to the retail banking space in particular. I've spoken to a number of software providers who have gone from offering off-the-shelf single solutions to creating platforms for people. But David, do you see an uptake in the industry with this? Do you see this shift towards platforms happening amongst the major banks? And you've already mentioned some things there, but if you go into a bit more detail into what's driving that change and what might drive that change over the next few years.
Sure. So to answer the question, are we seeing a shift towards the use of platforms? Yes and no. For the fintech operators, absolutely, we're seeing this. These guys, as we mentioned earlier, they get platforms. They don't have that technical debt. They understand the benefits of doing this, and they make the most of them. For some of the traditional players, they're still focusing to a degree on wanting what I would call solutions. Out-of-the-box solutions to solve a specific problem. That's how we've done things traditionally over the past 5, 10, 15 years. To my eyes, that mindset's a little bit limiting, but I fully understand that for many people, they've got a problem to solve, and they've got a budget to solve that single problem. So looking beyond that is a little bit challenging. It can be difficult. Also, the one thing that people do need to be aware of is that platforms require work. You're not delivering an out-of-the-box shrink wrap solution. They're almost like a platform for me is almost like trying to build a table from a piece of wood. You've got all the right pieces that you need, but you need the specific skills, and you need to put in some effort to actually turn that piece of wood into a table. And let's be honest, many organizations don't want to make that investment, or they simply don't have the skills to do it. And to that point, certainly organizations like Nuxio, we're trying to bridge that gap, if you like, by almost delivering a flat pack version of that table that you want to build. You still need to put some effort in, but new capabilities like low-code development tools and easy-to-use artificial intelligence model builders make that an awful lot easier than just building from that raw piece of wood. That all said, the major benefit that you get with a platform is that once you get the hang of it, you can pretty much build anything that you want on top of it again and again and again. So in my eyes, after that initial investment, the return that you get year on year, project on project, really does start to grow exponentially.
Okay, now, Scott, I know MasterCard operates multiple platforms and gateway services for your customers and clients. What's been the reaction from them to those services?
Well, I think the first thing I would say is that we do have multiple platforms and gateways, but actually the greatest strength that we as a brand have, I would argue, is actually that we have one consistent global network when it comes to making payments. And whenever I speak to clients, prospective clients, one of the first things I try and talk about is that it's we and a small number of other players, not just ourselves, have managed to build a network where a consumer can feel quite comfortable that the way they make a payment in the morning in London is the same as the same way they make a payment in Sao Paulo in the evening. And actually, when you think about that, there's very few other companies in the world that have managed to, in inverted commas, solve international payments in that way. And so I would argue to some extent one of our greatest strengths is the fact that we have one single global network platform with that many, merchants and billions of cardholders on it. What I do think, though, when I look at our customers and what they're looking to do, particularly from a gateway perspective, so in other words, receiving payments, mostly from consumers, is that, we're just seeing what our customers want there is flexibility. The last thing they ever want to do is feel like they've turned away a potential customer. And therefore, they want to feel that, that their shop is digitally open for any person in any way of safely, simply, and securely paying. And, the gateways that we run, the platforms we run, allow them that and provide potentially hundreds of different ways to actually pay, outside of just MasterCard. And we see the demand for that exponentially growing as, many of our customers seek to do business more further afield. There are a lot of domestic payment schemes, for instance, in certain countries that you'll want to accept. And so the basic, as David was saying, having a platform that can then be relatively simply and exponentially added to, and the proliferation now of simple, in inverted commas, to integrate APIs. We've seen those payment methods, massively grow in a relatively short period of time.
Excellent. Okay, so we're going to move on to the fun question of the bunch now. I'm going to ask both panelists to gaze into their crystal balls a little bit here. What technologies do you see being the foundation on which banks and financial services can face up to these digital giants, these big tech companies? David, I'm going to put the spotlight on you first, and then Scott can come in afterwards.
Great stuff. Well, I think you use the keyword there, foundation, right? And for me, if you look at the two really big challenges that traditional players have, first one is that level of technical debt, or the existing infrastructure and tools that they've got. And the second one is the difficulty that they have being agile and being flexible, often because of the size, the corporate structures that they've got, and the need to be compliant. So in terms of how we can use tech to address these, in my opinion, any solution needs to be built on a solid foundation, as you just said, which means that it needs to be built on a platform that can be used really to bridge the gap between those old legacy systems and that old technical debt and the new technical offerings. But that can also be used for multiple departments to deliver multiple solutions, as Scott just said. But to do it quickly, securely, and still in a robust manner. And the key, I think, is that once you have that platform in place, it actually becomes more about strategy than technology. It becomes a case of identifying the best projects to tackle and what order you tackle them in. So some are going to go with the low-hanging fruit, simple projects that can be delivered quickly to gain momentum, to gain rapid returns. Personally, I like that approach. Others will go with the projects that will deliver the biggest benefits, even if they're a little bit harder to deliver and they take a little bit longer. It's horses for courses, essentially. But again, the key to having a platform underpinning all of this is that you can go down either of those routes. It's entirely up to you. It doesn't matter to the platform. And, just to wrap this up, quite honestly, once you've got that platform in place, it allows you to start bringing in all of these other fancy new technologies, things like AI, robotic process automation, augmented reality, analytics, whatever you want. It allows you to bring those in to really start to compete with those big tech firms in terms of customer experience, customer engagement, and ultimately customer service.
Okay, so I'm gonna Scott, pick your buzzword at this point. Which one? Which technology do you find the most exciting going forward?
Well, I'll build off what David said from a platform perspective. So, assuming that's already there, I think I'm no technologist. I've been in this job 5 years, and there has been a buzzword du jour virtually every day that I've worked in this job. I would say the thing that I think we do see as being the most serious area of benefit potentially for financial services as a whole and payments in particular would be around the almost limitless applications of AI. I think, from our perspective, many of our customers, networks, and ourselves have actually been doing that sort of thing without ever in the past ever being called AI, right? I mean, the best area I would say for that would be in the likes of fraud. For a long time, many financial services businesses and ourselves have used data, big data, to try and understand, to manage, to minimize fraud, and to make our customers feel safe and secure in making payments. But that still, to some extent, relied on human interaction and rule changes and using the data, interpreting that data, and then deciding on an action. If we can take that piece out and for that machine to learn by itself, that I think would have arguably the most compelling impact on payments for a long, long time, and not just in payments. I mean, there's so many things you can apply that to from a financial services perspective, whether it's risk decisioning, loans, consumer behavior, customer behavior. So I think that, that for us is less a buzzword and more a way of life, and will become more a way of life for our customers over the next 2 or 3 years. I also see, in many of the fintechs that we work with, that are starting to some extent from a clean sheet of paper rather than that technology debt that David's been talking about. They're starting there, right, rather than building AI on top of stuff they've already got. And some of the things that they're looking at doing or services they're looking at providing are quite exciting. I think, from our perspective, that's the thing that we are most closely monitoring and getting involved in ourselves.
Okay, fantastic. I think the future is definitely bright for both technologists and banks. But I'd like to move on now to our live Q&A. We've had plenty of questions submitted, so thanks to everyone in the audience for doing so. We'll see how many we get through. First off, we're going to start with the questions submitted prior to us going live. And I'm actually going to build in one that we had submitted while we were doing the cast. So the question is, in what ways will regulation affect big tech companies attempting to enter the banking industry? And we also had someone ask us a similar question along similar lines, but asking about recent privacy and social responsibility concerns for some of the big techs, not naming any names. So David, do you want to take this one first, and then I'll come to Scott afterwards?
Sure, and I've got a big smile on my face as you're asking that question, not naming names about the big tech companies that are having challenges with privacy. Let's be clear about this. I don't think regulation of any type is going to stop the big tech companies entering the banking industry if they want to. They are spread across that many industries and that many sectors at the moment that regulation affects all of those. And they're being scrutinized, whether it's GDPR, whether it's the upcoming California Privacy Act, whether it's any one of the regulations that exist across the planet. They're already been scrutinized, so I don't think regulation will be something that stops them. I think the interesting thing, as a flip to this, though, there are areas where big tech are at a disadvantage, or big tech companies are at a disadvantage. And I think one of those areas is around the fact that they are now such big targets for people to try and hack into, to try and break those privacy guardrails, if you like. That the challenge that those big techs have is that they are going to be hacked at some point. And once an organization gets hacked, has customer data, passwords, usernames, whatever it happens to be, heaven forbid things like credit card details get hacked into. The brand reputation and the hit that will happen on that brand reputation at that point, it'll be very interesting to see how those big techs recover and respond and can still deliver financial services, banking services to an audience who will then become very, very skeptical. So I think that there are ways that big techs are hugely positive for this industry, but there are also ways that they are going to struggle with general consumer mood and awareness.
Sure, it definitely seems like something that you think some bankers tell themselves when they go to sleep at night, that they shouldn't be worried about the big tech firms, because the big tech firms won't want to deal with the raft of regulation that the bankers have to deal with. But Scott, I'm sure you've got an opinion you'd like to fire out about this one.
Yeah, I think there has been, there would appear to me from a personal perspective, beginning to be a little backlash to some extent with some of the big tech firms, both from a public policy and governmental perspective and from a consumer perspective. I would agree with David that I don't think any amount of regulation necessarily would keep them out or stop them from entering, nor should it actually to a large extent. But I do think that, again, I would come back to what we're talking about earlier. These big tech firms are very much in payments already and have been for some time now. And yet they have still chosen so far to mostly partner and to layer their services on top of what's already there. And that should give you some indication of the things that they're interested in and perhaps the things that they're less interested in. So, I still think that that's something that many of them are wrestling with. In saying that, if they become regulated themselves in many other ways, unlike fintech firms and large banks, then to some extent they're already being regulated by then, right? And so, that actually may encourage them to do more because they're already in that situation already. But I do think certainly it's something that many of them have. There's parts of payments that they want to do, and parts of payments that they're genuinely not that interested in. That may change, but that's certainly the current situation when it comes to payments. And I would imagine, I can talk less knowledgeably about this, but I would imagine it's the same for many other parts of financial services.
Okay, brilliant. We have another one as well submitted prior to us going live. Who do you think stands to benefit the most from this disruption and disintermediation of services that's occurring with the entrance of new technology players?
It's got one would hope that consumers and citizens are the ones that benefit from that, Alex, and certainly, as I mentioned earlier, we're a broad church, and I meet many of our partners very often, from the very largest banks to the smallest fintechs, and to a woman and to a man, their main aim is to serve their customers well, to serve their customers better tomorrow than they do today. The route to doing that may be different, and sometimes it may be more difficult. And that's why, for consumers, competition and disruption is absolutely fantastic. But I also think that there's space for partnership as well to deliver consumer products and offerings that take the very best of what fintechs are looking to do, and also what the more traditional players have been doing, and the services they've been providing for a long time. So I'm not telling you who will benefit. What I much rather prefer to answer is who should benefit, and that should be consumers and citizens of the world.
Sure. Okay, we'll move on to some of the live ones we've got going on here. So first one is an interesting one, actually, and perhaps something we didn't really cover in the webcast. Should banks be looking at their high street presence as an advantage? David, do you want to kick that one off?
Sure. For me, absolutely. But I think it needs to be done, or it will be best served if it's done in a very different way to, the way that high street operations have traditionally run. So if you think about a high street bank was all about providing banking services. I think the benefit in having a retail property or a physical property of any type now is not just in the physical execution of the day-to-day delivery of services, but it's about creating that brand equity, creating a place where people can go, where they feel comfortable dealing with the organization. And that's a little bit of an intangible, and I get that, but I think that's the sort of thing that, as we said, the big techs are doing now by delivering into so many different spaces. Who'd have thought that Amazon would be delivering TV services or music services? It's about delivering slightly different services from that same hub. That said, that's going to be a difficult thing for a lot of organizations to do because it's way outside of their traditional scope. But it's nice to see that some of the UK banks are starting to take that approach. And I think long may it continue. And I think if they can do that, then those high street properties can become very, very valuable to them.
Okay, fantastic. I apologise in advance, Scott, but I'm going to be putting you on the spot because we've had a number of live questions submitted asking about everyone's favourite buzzword, cryptocurrency and blockchain. So what role can emerging technologies like blockchain, distributed ledger technology, and even cryptocurrencies play in the removal of intermediaries and play into this battle between the big techs and the banks, if at all?
Yeah, thanks, Alex. Appreciate it. Another buzzword which does come up relatively often. I think, Mastercard's position on cryptocurrency is that we are, I suppose, in watch and see mode more than anything else, right? We see, we have our own blockchain, and we've done some research and done some limited testing, but we also know and understand that there are, a number of things around that certainly from a regulatory perspective that are, let's just say, interesting. For instance, for now, a couple of years ago, cryptocurrency was going to basically be the only way of paying in 10 years' time, right? And the only the only currency worth having. And then we had that boom and bust a couple of years ago, and things have died down a little bit more now. And I think that in a good way, in terms of the fact that the focus now is on how that technology, that distributed ledger technology, could be used in many different applications, right? Not just in payments, in rights ownership. I know that looking at it from a media perspective. And so, from our perspective, we're very much in a watch and learn mode at the moment, because we're not entirely certain where this technology will potentially take us. We are, we're playing a role in it in terms of working with some of our partners in looking at ways that could be applied. But, that's the situation we're currently in at the moment. We remain to be convinced that that's the next big thing compared to AI in the way that I was speaking about it earlier anyway.
Okay, fantastic. And I'm afraid that's all we have time for. I'll be sure to liaise with the panel post-webinar and get some answers to the remaining questions. And on that note, be sure to keep an eye out for the follow-up answers and a write-up of this webcast on Bob's Guide in the coming days. Thanks to everyone for joining us today. From myself, David Jones at Nuxio, and Scott Abrahams at Mastercard, thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.